Officials were scheduled to make a decision this afternoon about raising fares on the MBTA. Joining us with reaction are two advocates for riders. We'd like to welcome the Outreach Director at Transportation for Massachusetts, Josh Ostroff, and the Program Director for the Alliance for Business Leadership, Sebastian Zapata. Thank you both very much for being with us.
So glad to be here. Thank you, Chris.
I want to start with Josh. We've heard some of these figures, maybe around 5% on average, maybe around 9 or 10% on average, and put this in the context of that yawning budget gap that's going to take to fix the T.
Chris, well, first of all, thanks so much for having us on to talk to you and to your viewers. We're really pleased to be here and talk about transportation, which is just so important to everybody's life. And public transit is really the backbone of the region and of the economy, and for whether it's for businesses, employees, students, commuters, young and old alike. So the MBTA is looking at fares and fare increases, unfortunately greater than the 5% that was generally agreed to back in 2013 when the state started to turn the corner after years of disinvestment in transportation. But the two options that are on the table for the board to consider this afternoon look at average increases of 7% or about 10%. And the problem with both of those is that first they exceed the good faith effort by the legislature in 2013, but the effect is what concerns us. Hardship for people of limited means for whom transit is the only option. What it's going to mean for roads in the Boston area with low gas prices. More and more people will choose to take personal cars if they can, and the environmental impacts as well. So we're very concerned about the MBTA's options there and the process by which they arrived at these decisions, because overwhelmingly the public said we do not want to see either of these increases. So our coalition a statewide coalition of 58 organizations, including Sebastian's organization, is recommending a 5% maximum increase, and we'd be very disappointed if the board ultimately decided for something greater than that, for any number of reasons.
Sebastian, what about the concerns at the group that you represent?
Yeah, so at the Alliance for Business Leadership, we're very much a progressive coalition of business leaders, CEOs, and basically our understanding is that this isn't so much an issue about getting from point A to point B using public transit. It's really more about opportunity and access to opportunity. So whether it's you have to get to school on time or you have to get to your job on time, a lot of folks depend on the MBTA and public transit. And for a lot of them, it's their only option to get around. So for us, we see this as sort of a big moment where we're going to decide what are we going to do in terms of the riders. Are we going to look to have them pay off this short-term fix, which we don't believe is necessary, more than the 5%, as Josh mentioned, was the intention of the 2013 legislative matters? Or are we going to look to invest long-term, which is something that we should really be looking at to do in depth?
An interesting conundrum here, Sebastian, is that some of the employees at the businesses you represent, maybe they make enough money so they have other options, but I guess if they have other options, then, well, they'll use them. They'll drive, maybe.
Right, and that's absolutely the case for some of our folks, for sure. But you have to keep in mind, they have employees that they don't have that necessary luxury or amenity to use something that's not public transportation. For example, myself, my main mode of transportation, really my only mode of transportation, is public transportation. This is the way that a lot of folks are going to be able to get to their doctor's appointment, go to their school's concert recital, or whether it's get the job on time. This is the only way for a lot of these folks.
Josh, I guess one political baseline here is if riders don't pay some kind of increase, then why should anybody else chip in?
That's an excellent point. And we believe that some level of modest, predictable, regular increases is totally appropriate. You have to do that. And we are not advocating for no increase. You could make the case, because service doesn't necessarily deserve it. But we recognize that the system needs revenues to get where it needs to be, and it's going to take a long time to get there. But it's a matter of scale, Chris, because a 5% increase would give you several $1 million of revenue per year. The MBTA needs billions of dollars of investment. We've got decades-old track and signals and switches and stations that are inaccessible. It's going to take a substantial investment to get there, and we are looking for leadership at the state level and by Mayor Walsh and other municipal leaders to say it's time to restart the conversation about long-term revenue for the T. What's it going to take for this to be a world-class city? Because we can't retreat. If we want the workforce for Sebastian's member companies 5 or 10 years from now, they're not going to make do with yesterday's MBTA. So,
Sebastian, this is not just about fixing things here, and one thing our group might have in common with Mayor Walsh is that he wants to develop more transit-oriented housing, which means you need more service along those transit nodes. The innovation district is getting congested. I mean, it looks like you got to ask the T for even more, not just doing what they have well enough.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, you do have to look at all options in terms of strategically where do you plan to build from here on out. A lot of folks are moving back into the cities. We know that's the trend. No longer suburbia really the key anymore. So I think you sort of have to understand that, again, this is about access to opportunity. This is about building around what folks are going to be utilizing down the road. This is a long-term investment that we have to focus on. It's not about, a drop in the bucket, if you will, with this 5% or 6, 7%, maybe 10% increase. What you get off of that revenue is not going to offset the billions of dollars that's needed in infrastructure looking down the road.
Josh, there have been some figures about the way riders feel about the increase, and I guess one of the more interesting figures is the percentage of people who said that they would drop off the T. Now, those are, online surveys, but how seriously do you take those?
We take it really seriously because people do have choices. On the one hand, we're very concerned about folks for whom there's no choice, and this is a burden to them. In a region with such high cost of living, to add, several dollars per week to their commuting expenses is real. But it's just as important to look at folks for whom transit is an option, and they have the discretion to drive. You do not want to see people getting off the commuter rail and then driving on Boston's congested roads. The MBTA's own figures show that those people who would choose to drive, that could be 6-7 million more trips per year or more, automobile trips. That's bad for congestion. Our roads can't handle it. That's bad for environment. The climate cannot handle it. So we need the leadership at the state level to really think holistically. You mentioned housing. That's a great point, because we really need to be thinking of what's the future of Boston going to be, and not what is, how do we take care of the balance sheet today. We're making generational investments, and that's the way we want to be approaching this.
Right. And finally, Sebastian, a fare increase would take effect in July, but other revenue possibilities at best, that's down the road. I mean, doesn't the T need something right now that cannot otherwise fill that gap?
Right. And it absolutely does. Again, these fare increases are not going to be the end all be all to solve the big issue of what the deficit is. It's a few $1 million in comparison to a few $1 billion that we're talking about. Down the road, there are options that we can look at. For example, the Alliance of Business Leadership has endorsed the Fair Share Amendment that would go specifically towards funding transportation. So for right now, though, we are looking at leadership at the legislature to sort of step up and say, no, this is something that we're going to solve today because it's an issue for today.
All right, well, thank you both very much, Josh Ostroff and Sebastian Zapata. We should note, viewers, that we recorded this segment a little earlier today before the vote was taken on the fares, and we'll have more coverage later this week. We'll have more news in just a moment.